We talked in the last video about the prohibition that society normally places on killing and the strain that the demand to kill may place on soldiers. And indeed, this innate human resistance to killing may well be quite a considerable problem for military institutions, and one that they've endeavoured to overcome. A very influential study was produced after the Second World War by SLA Marshall. And Marshall's study resonated considerably within the US military, because what he had found in his study of soldiers' behavior in the Pacific conflict was that less than 15 to 20% of soldiers actually fired their weapons. And moreover, among those who fired, many chose to deliberately miss or not take aim. Marshall concluded that the average and healthy individual has such an inner and usually unrealized resistance towards killing a fellow man that he will not of his own volition take life if it is possible to turn away from that responsibility. At the vital point, the soldier becomes a conscientious objector. Now, this was quite a shocking finding in many ways, that most of the men fighting in war were actually not willing to carry out the orders that were given to them, orders that involved shooting and killing the enemy, and that therefore most of the effort in war was wasted. Now, it's true that in the years that have followed, the study conducted by Marshall has come under considerable scrutiny, and the methodology and some of the figures have been questioned. But nonetheless, it seems that Marshall did capture something that was happening, and certainly the military hierarchy took it very seriously and accordingly changed its methods of military training. Subsequent studies found much higher firing rates. In Korea, 55% of soldiers were thought to have fired their weapons. By the time we'd reached the Vietnam War, that statistic had reached 90%. And it's thought today that the firing rate is essentially 100%. So militaries have, certainly the US military, but other militaries have followed suit, have become much more effective at getting soldiers to do what is asked of them, effectively to fire their weapons and kill. So this raises the question for us, of course, of how soldiers are made into killers if killing is not something that comes naturally to most individuals. A first answer would reach for the notion of discipline. The 19th century French officer Charles Ardant du Pic proposes that the purpose of discipline is to make men fight in spite of themselves. Du Pic recognizing that fighting is not necessarily something that men can be made to do easily, and that it takes a very specific form of training and the inculcation of this notion of discipline to get soldiers to do what is asked of them. And so one of the ways in which you prepare soldiers, in which you instill discipline, is the use of drilling, by which we mean the intensive training in marching and the use of weapons, what we associate very commonly with military training. And so in the rest of this video we will look at these techniques of drilling and think about how they operate, how they work, how they achieve the objective of making men or women into soldiers. For this purpose, we are going to turn to the writings of Michel Foucault. Now, Foucault authored in the 1970s a book called Discipline and Punish. It's mostly concerned with as its subtitle implies, The Birth of the Prison. But it has an early chapter, which you will have seen in the readings, that is concerned primarily with the early military of the 17th and 18th centuries. And Foucault makes a very important claim here because he articulates the view that the military in this period was the social laboratory in which new techniques of power were developed and trialed before being extended to the rest of society. And this plays a key role in one of the central arguments in Discipline and Punish, that modern societies, or early modern societies at any rate, moved from a form of sovereign power as the ways in which they were governed and regulated to what Foucault calls disciplinary power. Sovereign power for Foucault was associated with, as its name indicates, monarchical power. This is the power that comes down from the king, from the leader, which enforces itself on the social body, for instance, by demanding labor power, for instance, by asking feudal peasants to give one of their days of the week to work on the lord's land, or to pay tribute or taxes. Punishment under sovereign power is often spectacular and demonstrative, involves public displays of torture and death. Disciplinary power, on the other hand, is a more subtle form of power, a less visible form of power, which becomes concerned not only with what the body does, where it deploys its labor, for instance, but also how it does it. It begins to shape the body itself, its posture, its gait, its motions, and it monitors the individual much more tightly and closely than sovereign power. It plays a much greater role in shaping the subjectivity of the individual. So let us see how disciplinary power applies in the context of military training. The first place to start really is in the late 16th century, where the Dutch army of Maurice of Nassau, one of the preeminent military leaders of the time, adopted drill and cadenced step, so regular marching, in a manner that had been absent from Europe since the Roman Empire. So a whole new sets of training techniques and disciplinary modes were introduced by Nassau and spread very rapidly through European armies in the following 2 centuries. This is quite closely linked to the development of firearms, and we've already talked about the importance of the gunpowder revolution in the rise of the state. One of the aspects of this was that early firearms were, by contemporary standards, quite primitive. They were slow to reload. You had to reload them from the muzzle. They were very inaccurate and could not fire over great distances. So in fact, the only real way to use these weapons effectively on the battlefield was through coordinated volleys. So it demanded of troops that they move in synchronous motion together in time so that they could deliver their weapons as a block. And we'll see in a moment what kinds of techniques of training followed from this. But returning to Foucault for now, Foucault gives us an account of disciplinary power in which he describes the important components of disciplinary power, the elements that you find in all forms of disciplinary power. And once again, Foucault starts on the military, but then is keen to show that these apply much more widely to the prison, to the factory, to the school. The first dimension of disciplinary power, first modality of disciplinary power, is a spatial distribution. That is to say, an allocation of bodies in space. And this, in the military context, takes two aspects. One is the aspect of enclosure. So this is the spatial confinement of individuals within a precise location. So in the military context, the fact that military troops were expected to stay within barracks, that while they are in the army, the places they can be is very closely monitored and regulated. They can't leave the military barracks at will. They can only do so at very specific times and with the permission of their superiors. The spatial distribution also applies to the development of military formations, particularly in this period, linear formations. So if you think back to the previous slide, the ways in which armies displayed themselves on the battlefield in very tight regiment, following geometric shapes rather than just assembling as a crowd. A second aspect or modality of disciplinary power is what Foucault calls the microphysics of power. What Foucault means by microphysics is the way in which power acts on the body itself. Again, we're back to this question of how power affects the how of an action, not just the what of an action. So, for instance, this has to do, in the context of the early military, with the very precise instructions given for the firing of muskets. So it was not, the power did not only involve telling soldiers that they had to fire their musket at a particular moment under a particular order, but also determined all the stages that were necessary to take in the arming of the musket, the aiming of the musket, and the firing of the musket. So, for instance, in the Prussian military manual of 1726, we find this task broken down into as many as 76 individual stages. So here on this slide, you've got merely 6 of these stages. And these military manuals were supposed to outline precisely the ways in which these actions should be carried out, so that when troops were trained, they would be expected to perform these actions in a very precise way. So soldiers would take up a particular posture, would move their bodies in a particular way, would load, aim and fire their weapons in a very precise, prescribed manner to which they should all ascribe. This, of course, brings up this idea of the military as a machine composed of identical parts. Again, this is replicated further in the idea of cadenced marching. The idea that troops should march at very specific speeds in coordination according to a predetermined rate and body posture. And you'll be well aware how important marching is within armies. We see it particularly in military displays, that of course have more symbolic than martial value, but they remain a very core aspect of military training, even when marching of this nature does not, of course, take place on the battlefield at all. Thirdly, and finally, the last component of disciplinary power, as Foucault outlines it, is the practice of constant surveillance. So Foucault explains how, in order to shape the body, in order to train the individual into the obedient, disciplined body that is intended for it, the individual must be continually observed. Are they performing the actions that are required of them? Evaluated. How are they faring in relation to an existing model? They need to be ranked and classified. Are they doing well? Are they doing badly? How are they comparing to others? All of which then leads potentially to punishment or reward. More often punishment. Reward tends to be the absence of punishment very often in the military. Frederick the Great, the Prussian king of the 18th century, expressed the idea that troops should fear their commander more than the enemy. And again, of course, we think of military training, we associate military training with drill instructors who are very strict and severe with their forces, with their troops, and are constantly judging their performance of the tasks required of them. So summing up, it's through the exercise of disciplinary power, through these modalities of disciplinary power, spatial distribution, microphysics of power that acts directly on the body, and constant surveillance and punishment or reward, which is the means by which conformity with expectation can be measured. Through all these means, the individual can be made into a military subject. Now, Foucault, of course, as I've said before, is keen to note that these disciplinary technologies spread throughout the social body, that we can recognize them in prisons, in schools, hospitals, army barracks, and workshops, that in all these spaces there is a distribution of bodies, there is a microphysics of power taking place, there is a form of assessment and monitoring and evaluation, and all of which could be applied to the current day as well. Now, this is not an insight, in fact, that was entirely new to Foucault. In the early 20th century, Max Weber had noted that the discipline of the army gives birth to all discipline. Military discipline is the ideal model for the modern capitalist factory. A further point that needs to be made here is that the development of drill should be seen within the wider context of the imposition of state control and discipline over the military. So this brings us back to the session on war and the rise of the state. Remember again Weber's own definition of the state as a monopoly of violence, and that this monopoly of violence entailed that the military would be the obedient extension of state will. And so we can see, or we can associate the development of these techniques of training in the barracks with another range of developments at the same period that involve the foundation of state militaries, as opposed to the more disparate forms of military power that exist before, that were much more closely associated with feudal structures, autonomous centers of power within a less vertical social structure. So, for instance, we could note that it's around the 18th century that we see uniforms being introduced. Prior to that, soldiers clothed themselves. So increasingly we have this homogeneous appearance that comes in, where the soldier is subsumed, or the soldier's identity is subsumed within the military organization. And indeed, becoming a member of the military is to be stripped of a pre-existing identity. With the professional armies of the 17th and 18th century, we also see the creation of a stricter officer hierarchy, in which officers start losing autonomy in the recruitment, payment, administration of units. So there's a central bureaucratic structure within the military that establishes itself. That means that all the process of recruitment and training and so forth goes through a central structure, is no longer determined by semi-autonomous centers of power. We could also note the ways in which public military exercises, where the skills of drill are on display, the marching, the disciplined performance of actions, can also be seen as public demonstrations of allegiance to the state. These big public military exercises typically involve military forces walking in front of the political leaders, symbolizing the discipline and submission of the military apparatus to the state. So how then does drill produce the particular subject of the soldier from this disciplinary perspective? Well, if drill is designed to produce a particular type of subject, then a preliminary process is the erasure of prior forms of identification or subjectivity. Within the military, under this view, individuality is undesirable. Strict discipline and identification with the corps is required. Hence, from this view perspective, all the techniques of depersonalization involved in joining the military. I've already touched on the use of the uniform, but one might think also about rules on military haircuts, typically the shaving of the head, the lack of privacy involved in life in the barracks, the constantly forced social relationships that take place, the tight schedules involved in regimented life, the lack of sleep that is often a part of military training, the arbitrary rules that are imposed that seem to be there not for any rational reason per se, but only because they are the rules and that soldiers have to be trained to obey the rules. And of course the very strict forms of punishment that are applied in order to enforce obedience to the rules and conformity with the requirements of training. In some cases, it's necessary to break any individual expression of resistance to the drill, or perhaps any confidence in the recruit that drill exercises can be easily completed. Individuals have to their resistance to the drill has to be overcome through punishment and through sanction for non-conformity, or the drill has to be ramped up to the point where the individual may doubt that they can complete it and therefore give themselves over entirely to the training. Once disciplined, the soldier will have been trained to act reliably and consistently under the stress of combat. So one view of drill training, and I think one that's compatible with or coherent with the account that Foucault gives us of disciplinary power, is that the soldier is submitted to a form of conditioning in which desired behavior is reinforced through a system of rewards. You get promoted, you get time off, or punishments. You're deprived of certain privileges or even just of certain basic necessities or amenities, or you're submitted to further drill. Do me another 100 push-ups for failing to perform the drill exercise. So this presents a vision of the soldier as something like an automaton, like a programmed individual who is expected to unthinkingly react on the battlefield on the basis of their training or conditioning. But we could ask how satisfactory that is as an account of the soldier today. Bearing in mind that, of course, Foucault's disciplinary power is concerned or only really covers the training of soldiers in the 18th and 17th centuries, when these were, of course, different societies from the present, but also different kinds of wars. When we think about contemporary militaries, there are ways in which this account of the soldier as an automaton may not be entirely satisfactory. For one, liberal Western societies are increasingly reticent to condone the kind of disciplinary authoritarianism required by old-fashioned drilling. Again, this kind of touches on the idea of the civilization of the military, whereby certain ways in which trainees might have been treated in the past are no longer permissible, might be considered as forms of bullying, might fall under certain regulations in health and safety, or simply do not conform to certain more kind of democratic ideals we have about human dignity and the way individuals should be treated. Secondly, the increasing complexity of operational environments and the tasks asked of soldiers very often demands more than mindless automatons. Much greater emphasis is being placed on intelligence, flexibility, and creative adaptability. So we increasingly see in contemporary militaries forms of leadership that promote consensus building and consent over unquestioning submission to authority. That is not to say that militaries do not still seek to govern the conduct of their to govern the conduct of their soldiers and to ensure desired forms of behavior, but rather that the means are evolving away from more coercive means towards more subtle forms of control. One disposition is the insertion of the soldier within complex socio-technical systems, which distance the individual from the consequence of their actions, offering a diminished sense of personal responsibility and reduced opportunities for resistance. Indeed, it's easier to resist orders or authority when that authority is personified, when it's a particular individual barking orders at you, when you are encompassed within a system where you perform smaller functions within it. Occasions and opportunities for resistance are more difficult to identify and encounter. So, for instance, one could think about the ways in which physical distance, present in the use of artillery or aerial bombing, facilitates the performance of military tasks because the individual is not in immediate contact with the consequence of their actions. Again, perhaps the fear of killing does not have to be confronted in the same way. Similarly, a form of perceptual distanciation can be achieved by the mediation of war through technology. When the battle zone is observed through thermal imagery or night vision or perhaps virtual reality, the individual no longer has to witness in the same visceral fashion the effects of their actions. Finally, one might think of the different ways in which behavior can be channeled through human-machine integration, whether computerized decision aids, mood-regulating drugs, health vitals diagnostics, gene therapy, nanotechnology, or brain-computer connections. All sorts of ways in which the behavior of the individual can be circumscribed, directed, oriented in subtle fashion that deprive the individual either of a sense of responsibility or strips the possibilities or the space in which resistance or escape from expected behavior is available. In 1991, the US Army Science Board produced a report entitled "The Soldier as a System," which is a notion that's become increasingly widely adopted. According to this notion, the soldier must be managed as a system, with a focus on the functional integration of its constitutive elements, the organic elements, the clothing elements, the individual equipment, and so forth. All these elements need to be designed together, according to this view. It calls for a systems engineering approach that ensures the compatibility and interchangeability of all the parts of the system and guides the design of these parts. And of course, if we're engineering the entire system, then perhaps we are also involved in engineering the human component. So once again, the forms of discipline described by Foucault might well have been effective ones at the particular time, but are perhaps quite primitive and crude compared to the much more sophisticated forms of control that are already being applied and are likely to develop further in the future. But all this still potentially leaves unaddressed perhaps the main reason why soldiers kill at war, which is not out of patriotic fervour and ideological conviction, or even because they have necessarily been programmed or engineered to do so, but rather that soldiers may kill primarily, first and foremost, for their immediate fellow soldiers. The ethologist, which is to say the scholar of animal behavior, Conrad Lorenz, submitted the view that man is not a killer, but the group is. And with this, Lawrence is hinting at perhaps an important truth, which is that the more the responsibility for killing is shared and within a group, the more easily that killing can take place. The less that responsibility falls on the conscience of a single individual. It's already been observed that weapon systems that are manned by several individuals tend to be more effective. If there are several individuals responsible for operating an artillery gun or an aerial bomber, and each of them is doing a small part of the action necessary to operate the system, then the system is much more likely to be operated as desired because responsibility has been distributed. But there's not only that responsibility that's distributed, there's also a pressure that individuals feel to not let down their comrades, that they have a responsibility to their fellow soldiers. Indeed, numerous studies suggest that individual soldiers kill above all for their unit and their fellow soldiers. That soldiers fight as members of small groups out of a sense of mutual protection and loyalty. An influential study by Janowitz and Schills studied the combat performance of the Wehrmacht, the German military, in the Second World War. And what they noted was that the German military continued to perform very well despite the increasingly desperate course of the war. So that as the war progressed and as it became clear that Germany was going to lose the war, one might have expected the morale of the army to collapse and the performance of the military units to decline. But Janowitz and Schills did not see that. And so they asked the question of why that was. And they concluded that this motivation necessary to continue fighting was not primarily to be found in a belief in National Socialism or a patriotic commitment, but rather could be located in the bonds to what they refer to as the primary group. That's to say, the immediate combat unit or squad. And they concluded that as long as sound leadership, mutual support, and attachment to certain markers of identity, notably ideas of masculinity and or any notions that effectively gave the group a core identity, so long as all these things were maintained, individual commitment to the group remained high and combat performance correspondingly sustained itself. So in this view, and we see this in the article by Smith, who in a way takes issue with certainly an interpretation of Foucault as viewing training as the production of automatons. Smith says that military training is less about creating these atomized automatons with heavily drilled combat skills than it is about fostering group bonding and solidarity. So in other words, training does not only impart special skills about how to fight war, about how to act and perform under the stressful conditions of war, but also serves to bring the individuals who train together into a cohesive unit with a strong group identity, since this will ultimately be the key motivation factor that will allow soldiers to keep performing as required. So in this sense, the de-individuation that is very real and that is enforced as individuals enter the military is not merely designed to make individuals into unthinking machines, but rather as a precondition to achieving a new group identity. And crucially, a group identity that is a rather small and restrained identity. It is not an identity with the military as a whole or with the nation. It is identity with the peer group of individuals, the ones that they know at an intimate and personal level. And indeed, we can see that within militaries, there are very distinct identities formed by platoons and regimental groups and rivalries and different slanders thrown at other members of the same armed forces who are not within that group. So in that sense, we can pay more attention to the aspect of training that relates to various rituals and symbols that could serve to develop what's called esprit de corps, a French term again, which means literally spirit of body. Body here, the corps, could be, of course, the body, human body, but also the military corps, a group of soldiers. What's interesting, of course, as well in thinking about rituals and symbols is that some of these are not formal parts of training or imposed top-down. One might think, for example, of various practices of hazing. These are, various forms of sometimes fairly ghastly rituals of introduction into the group, sometimes humiliating or what have you, but are designed to bring individuals into the collective identity. And these often do not come from something that's enforced from the part of the military hierarchy, but rather grows organically as part of the tradition of a particular group or corps, and corresponds to that, to bringing in soldiers into a long-standing group identity. To this, we might add the perspective advanced by the historian William McNeill. McNeill's produced a fascinating history of dance and drill, in which he's interested in what he refers to as muscular bonding. The ways in which moving in motion, in which synchronized movement builds solidarity and group cohesion. So, obviously, he gives the examples of drill and marching exercises, and he emphasizes the importance of the role of music. Now, military music is very basic music, but it performs the key function, which is to produce a steady rhythm and to help coordinate bodies together. But of course, this form of muscular bonding, the ways in which groups can be brought together through coordination and rhythm, is one that extends far beyond the military. And we can see this in all sorts of crowd dynamics. The ways in which football crowds build group cohesion through chants and various performed actions. The ways in which protest movements also build intra-group solidarity through coordinated movement, through song and dance. So McNeill is very important in a sense in bridging what we might think of as the physical aspect of drill and training and the symbolic, ritualistic dimension. That is not merely about producing certain symbols, but it is in fact very embodied action that produces group solidarity. Robert Graves expressed the idea that arms drill as it should be done is beautiful, especially when the company feels itself as a single being, and each movement is not a synchronized movement of every man together, but the single movement of one large creature. So again, this is partly what we are concerned with here, is the ways in which a collective being is created as a consequence of synchronized movement. And therefore, arms drill can be, or drill more generally, can be understood very clearly in this way. Summing up, we therefore are able, I think, to draw the conclusion that Foucault's account of disciplinary power is certainly illuminating in understanding techniques which can strive to make the soldier into a compliant cog in the military machine, particularly when we extend the analysis to think about more subtle forms of control that might be more prevalent in the contemporary context. But we can also understand drill as an enabler of a key component of the formation of small groups, dynamics, and solidarity bonds, all of which are crucial to the willingness to kill and commit sacrifice in the context of war. And that drill can therefore be seen to serve both functions. Drill serves simultaneously to instill specific skills, muscle memory that will be essential to armed forces when they are on the front and they are submitted to the stressful conditions of war. But drill can also be seen as one of the ways in which the ties between individuals are brought together. Because war is ultimately a collective activity, and it is very often through the solidarity bonds that are assembled, that are tied between individuals within them, that we can find one of the most powerful motives for combat and for killing.